Look at this graph. It's not just a chart, it's a story of an economy struggling to find its footing. After Brexit, the UK's GDP has taken a hit, with growth stagnating and contractions threatening to push the nation into recession. And the numbers behind this story? They're even more alarming. A recent report by Cambridge Econometrics, commissioned by City Hall, reveals that Brexit has cost the UK economy nearly £140 billion. London alone accounts for a staggering £30 billion of that loss, with 290,000 fewer jobs than there would have been without Brexit. But this is just the beginning. Beneath the surface, some of the UK's most vital industries are on the brink of collapse. So how deep does the damage go? And what are the 5 most effective British industries fighting to survive this economic storm? Let's find out in the next minutes. Number 5. The automotive industry. The UK automotive industry, once a cornerstone of British manufacturing, is in crisis. Since Brexit, the sector has faced a perfect storm of challenges that have pushed production to its lowest level in 66 years. Let's explore why this is happening and what it means for the future of car manufacturing in Britain. First, let's talk about numbers. In 2022, the UK produced just 775,014 cars, a staggering 41% decline compared to 2019, and the lowest production level since 1956. Compare this to pre-pandemic figures of 1.3 million cars annually, and the scale of the collapse becomes painfully clear. While global issues like COVID-19 and semiconductor shortages have played a role, the UK's woes are largely self-inflicted. One of the biggest blows? The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA, between the UK and EU, which introduced rules of origin requirements. For an electric vehicle, or EV, to avoid tariffs, at least 40% of its parts must originate in the UK or EU. This threshold will rise to 45% in 2024 and 55% by 2027, making compliance nearly impossible for UK manufacturers. Most EV batteries, a key component that can make up to 50% of a car's value, are sourced from China, leaving UK car makers in a bind. Major players like Stellantis, Jaguar Land Rover or JLR, and Ford are already raising red flags. Stellantis, the global giant behind brands like Peugeot, Citroën and Vauxhall, has warned that it might have to abandon its UK operations unless trade rules are renegotiated. This threat isn't just bluster, it's a lifeline for the 5,000-plus jobs Stellantis provides in the UK. Meanwhile, the EU is racing ahead. France, for instance, has created a battery valley in northern regions, attracting investments like the €7 billion subsidy for Taiwanese battery maker Prologium. By contrast, the UK's attempt to build its battery production capabilities, such as the ill-fated British Volt project, has ended in disaster, with British Volt collapsing under £120 million of debt. But Brexit isn't the only villain here. The lack of a cohesive industrial strategy from the UK government has compounded the problem. While countries like the US and EU are funneling billions into EV supply chains, UK manufacturers are left with puny sums, as critics put it. For example, Stellantis reportedly received £30 million in government support, peanuts compared to the €7 billion its Italian operations secured. Adding to the chaos, manufacturers like Honda and Ford have already shuttered plants in Swindon and Bridgend, respectively. Toyota's future in the UK hangs in the balance, with a decision expected later this year on its hybrid production in Burnaston. The grim reality? By 2028, JLR and Nissan may be the only major car makers left in the UK. The numbers don't lie. Brexit has eroded Britain's competitiveness in the global automotive market. Let's talk about a side of Brexit you might not have heard much about: the harsh impact it's had on the UK's agricultural sector. Number 4. The agriculture. Brexit's bitter harvest. For many farmers, the promise of a brighter, more independent future has been overshadowed by economic struggles, red tape and broken promises. Before Brexit, the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, provided billions in subsidies, effectively keeping many farms afloat. But after leaving the EU, these subsidies were phased out in England, leaving farmers scrambling to adapt. To make matters worse, Brexit introduced significant trade barriers. A new requirement for export health certificates alone added a staggering £60 million to food export costs in 2021. Now, let's talk about the numbers. Crop farmers were some of the hardest hit. In 2020, the UK experienced extreme weather, a late planting season, and a shortage of seasonal workers due to Brexit and the pandemic. This led to a 26% drop in cereal production, including staples like wheat, barley, and oats. Although crop income recovered to £13.3 billion in 2022, the challenges aren't over. Livestock farmers also have felt the pinch. While red meat prices have surged, the free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand opened the floodgates to duty-free imports of meat and dairy, threatening the long-term viability of British farmers. Over 69% of farmers surveyed by Farmers Weekly reported that Brexit negatively affected their businesses, with vegetable and pig farmers particularly struggling. Let's not forget the red tape. Remember those promises of a bonfire of bureaucracy? Farmers say the opposite has happened. Over 58% reported an increase in paperwork, with fruit and vegetable growers who rely heavily on overseas labour bearing the brunt. Meanwhile, small farmers, especially those with less than 20 hectares, have struggled to navigate the growing administrative burden. What about solutions? Diversification has been one response. Nearly 50% of surveyed farmers in 2022 plan to expand into non-farming ventures, while others are trying to boost productivity. In Wales and Scotland, where subsidies still exist, farmers fear the inevitable cuts. The Welsh Farmers Union estimates a £225 million funding shortfall over the current parliamentary term. Similar grievances are echoed in Scotland, where projected losses could reach £93 million by 2025. For many, these subsidies are the difference between profit and loss. So, what's the bigger picture? Brexit promised freedom and opportunity, but for UK farmers, it has often felt like being left out in the cold. With rising costs, reduced subsidies, and competitive pressure from global markets, the agriculture sector continues to grapple with the fallout. Farmers are now asking, where's the insurance policy for their livelihoods? As agriculture struggles with labour issues and export challenges, the healthcare sector tells a different story of Brexit's impact. Let's explore the implications of Brexit on the healthcare sector. Number 3. The healthcare system. Brexit was supposed to be a game changer for the UK's National Health Service, or NHS. The Leave campaign painted a rosy picture, reclaiming £350 million a week from the EU to fund the NHS. Yet 8 years later, the reality tells a very different story. So how exactly has Brexit impacted the healthcare sector? Let's unravel the numbers and facts. Firstly, let's talk about funding. While the NHS budget increased by £400 million per week between 2016 and 2019, this wasn't the windfall voters were promised. The rise in funding came from taxes, borrowing, and squeezing other sectors, not Brexit savings. Worse, this increase barely kept pace with the demands of a growing, ageing population. Equipment investments lagged behind global benchmarks, leaving the NHS cash-strapped and unable to address deep-rooted issues. Now on to staffing, a critical blow. Before Brexit, nurses and doctors from EU countries filled essential roles in the NHS and social care. Post-Brexit, this flow nearly halted. Stringent language tests and the absence of free movement caused the EU nurse recruitment to plummet to near zero, while EU social care workers dropped from 8% to 7% in 2 years. Some medical specialties like heart and lung surgery and psychiatry face severe shortages that haven't been resolved. To patch this gap, the UK turned to non-EU nations, ramping up international recruitment. Between 2016 and 2022, the number of non-EU doctors licensed in the UK soared from 72,000 to 112,000, and non-EU nurses from 67,000 to 124,000. But this approach has limits. Unlike EU free movement, these recruits need expensive visas and meet skill and salary thresholds, leaving the underfunded social care sector unable to compete. And then there's the issue of medicine shortages. The number of medicines requiring emergency price adjustments jumped from 20 per month pre-Brexit to over 100 post-Brexit. Pharmacists now routinely rewrite prescriptions to manage shortfalls under serious shortage protocols. While some of this mirrors global trends, the UK stands out. Imports of medicines dropped significantly post-Brexit, suggesting trade barriers are a factor. Even promises of faster drug approvals post-Brexit have largely fallen flat. As of late 2022, 9 out of the last 20 medicines approved in the EU weren't yet available in the UK, putting the country behind the EU and the US in introducing innovative treatments. So what's the bottom line? Brexit amplified the cracks in the UK's healthcare system, straining staffing, inflating drug costs, and deepening funding challenges. While there's room for solutions like better workforce planning and closer EU negotiations, the political will seems lacking. For now, the NHS remains at the mercy of tough trade-offs and economic pressures, carrying the weight of Brexit's fallout. With healthcare battling resource constraints, the construction sector emerges as another casualty of Brexit. Let's examine the critical challenges faced by the construction industry as a result of Brexit. Number 2. The UK construction industry. Brexit didn't just change how the UK trades, it fundamentally disrupted industries, and one of the hardest hit sectors has been construction. Generating £90 billion annually and employing over 3 million people, construction is a cornerstone of the UK economy. But since the 2016 referendum, the industry has faced spiralling costs, crippling labour shortages, and plummeting exports. Let's break it down. First, the numbers paint a grim picture. Between 2015 and 2022, the cost of construction materials like cement, timber, and steel skyrocketed by 60% in the UK. For context, that's almost double the 35% rise seen across the EU during the same period. And labour costs? Those have surged 30% in the UK, compared to just 14% in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands. Why such a steep rise? Brexit introduced new trade barriers and complicated supply chains, making it more expensive to import essential materials. Add the energy crisis and the global disruptions like COVID-19, and the perfect storm for inflated costs emerged. But according to experts, Brexit shoulders about 40% of this burden, more than any other single factor. Labour shortages have been another massive blow. The UK's construction sector, once heavily reliant on EU workers, has lost a significant chunk of its labour force. In fact, a post-Brexit shortfall of 330,000 workers have left the industry struggling to meet demand. And while major companies have been able to navigate these challenges by absorbing the increased costs and bureaucracy, smaller businesses are buckling under the pressure. Take exports, for instance. Construction product exports to the EU are now more than 1/3 lower than pre-Brexit levels. Small firms, lacking the resources to handle the new administrative and financial burdens, have been particularly hit. Even domestic projects are suffering. Rising costs and labour shortages have delayed builds and inflated budgets, making affordable housing and infrastructure projects increasingly unattainable. With fewer workers and skyrocketing material prices, the industry is operating in survival mode rather than driving economic growth. So what's the government's response? Officials point to global factors like the pandemic and high demand as culprits, claiming these issues aren't unique to the UK. But experts argue that Brexit's role in amplifying these problems cannot be ignored. As Hilary Benn, former chair of the House of Commons Brexit Committee, put it, Brexit has created more obstacles than opportunities for UK businesses. As the construction sector struggles to lay its foundations in a post-Brexit era, the hospitality industry faces its own storm. Let's take a closer look on how Brexit has reshaped the UK's hospitality landscape and what it means for the future. Number 1. The hospitality. The UK hospitality industry, a vital pillar of the economy, has been battered by the consequences of Brexit. Once thriving on the influx of EU workers and seamless trade with Europe, the sector is now grappling with soaring costs, crippling labour shortages, and a loss of cultural vibrancy. Before Brexit, EU nationals formed 12.3% of the UK hospitality workforce, with many filling critical roles in hotels, restaurants and bars. But post-Brexit immigration policies have made it harder and costlier for EU citizens to work in the UK. Since 2019, over 120,000 EU workers have left the hospitality industry. This mass exodus has left the sector with a staggering skills gap, resulting in a labour shortage of 11%. And it's not just a staffing crisis. Brexit has disrupted supply chains, driving up the cost of food and drink imports from Europe. New customs checks, tariffs, and administrative burdens have led to longer delays and higher prices for products like wine, cheese, and fresh produce. The Food and Drink Federation, or FDF, reports that these additional costs are being passed on to consumers, contributing to inflation and putting further pressure on hospitality businesses. The numbers are stark. Inflation in late 2022 hit a 40-year high, with food and drink prices skyrocketing. Some European tour operators, like one organising bespoke trips to Scotland, have had to double the cost of their packages, citing skyrocketing hotel and service prices in the UK. What once cost €6,000 now costs closer to €12,000, with no extra profit to show for it. Culturally, the impact is just as profound. EU workers didn't just fill gaps in the labour force, they brought a cosmopolitan energy and authenticity that enriched the UK's culinary and hospitality landscape. Now that diversity is dwindling, leaving a noticeable void in the sector's offerings. Brexit's promise of prosperity and labour market control have largely fallen flat. Pubs and restaurants are closing early, supply chains are stretched thin, and the industry faces a future of diminished cultural and economic vibrancy. While events like King Charles's coronation and Eurovision may briefly boost tourism, long-term solutions are critical. Revisiting immigration policies to attract skilled workers, offering a financial support to struggling businesses, and fostering cultural exchange could help restore what Brexit has taken away. The question is, will the UK take the steps needed to save its hospitality sector, or will it continue to lose one of its most defining industries? Overall, Brexit's impact on the UK's economy and industries paints a picture of unforeseen challenges and ongoing adjustments. From automotive to agriculture, healthcare to construction and hospitality, the ripple effects of leaving the European Union have tested resilience across the board. While some sectors strive to adapt and innovate, the journey ahead remains uncertain. The future of the UK's economy depends on how these challenges are addressed and the lessons learned from this pivotal chapter in its history.